In the last chapter in the epilogue of the book, you talk about coming home from Guantanamo and talk about the reception and plans for the future. How would you rewrite those chapters today?
I don't know that I would rewrite the chapters about the epilogue in my book. I finish off saying that American justice in Guantanamo is an oxymoron. There are two conflicting concepts. The concept of justice in Guantanamo, I believe, has not been administered to any of the prisoners there, not the ones that have been released, not the ones who have habeas corpus petitions pending in the US courts, nor the ones facing the US military commissions. So there wouldn't be a great deal after 6 years to rewrite.
And what would justice look like then for those who have been released, for instance?
Well, what happens when a person has been falsely imprisoned, tortured, abused, and their basic human rights violated in any other circumstance? The people who did it are prosecuted, they are compensated, they are given access to medical and psychological treatment. And there is a recognition in the world that what happened to these people was wrong. That has not happened with the Guantanamo cases, in any of the cases. Every fight has been a fight to the death in metaphorical terms. Nobody's given an inch in terms of the governments that were involved, either complicitly, like the British government, or directly, like the US government. And so we, as the former Guantanamo prisoners, still carry the stigma of being Guantanamo prisoners.
When President Obama in 2009, as one of his first acts since coming into power, decided to sign the order essentially with the aim of closing Guantanamo Bay, what was your reaction at the time, and were you hopeful, or did you have a sense that this was going to be the...
I remember the time when Obama came into power and had actually made the statements that he will close down Guantanamo, he will stop the secret detention sites, and he will put an end to torture. I was actually touring the UK at the time with a former Guantanamo soldier, a guard, who'd once served there. And both of us took this reaction to say that it was too little, too late, meaning that we had already seen, on both sides of the wire, as it were, the effects of the Bush policy. To say that he was going to close it was only reiterating what Bush himself had said several times: I would like to see the place closed. So it was nothing new. It was, as they say, an old wine in new bottles. And what we saw and what we've seen thus far in the difference between Obama and Bush is that Bush was the president who ordered extrajudicial detention. Obama is the president who has ordered extrajudicial killing and maintained the extrajudicial detentions. Nothing has changed greatly. Very few numbers, relatively speaking, have been released under Obama. There are still over 171, or there are 171 prisoners still there, with no foreseeable end to their plight.
On a more personal level, you talk about being away from your family. How were you able to knit your relationships with your family?
In reality, Guantanamo has destroyed the relationships that existed between family members. That's putting it bluntly, as much as possible, without going into too much personal detail. I think that's happened across the board. It happened in my case, and happened in the case of many other people. Relationships that have been built upon absolutely no communication, built upon fear and hope and sadness and tears, and then to come home to see children that I've never seen in some cases, to see other children who've grown up to the point that they are no longer those young children, to step into the family where your position is no longer recognized because those roles have been filled. And there never has been a system by the British government or the US government that has recognized this aspect of human life, that has simply shattered the relationships between people, men, women, children, and simply said, well, you were in Guantanamo, not even a sorry, now you're back home, pick up your life, that's your problem now.
How did you do that?
For me, it was, and I think for a lot of the prisoners, we didn't have these support mechanisms that people had. I remember in Guantanamo, for example, the American soldiers had combat stress, which we found sort of a bit laughable because there was no combat there, but there was plenty of stress. But we weren't getting the counseling. The soldiers were getting the counseling. So we returned home to face life as it is. In addition to being returned as freemen, we returned to a post-9/11 world, a post-July the 7th world, in which Islamophobia was a key factor and remains to be a key factor. So we are now regarded as a fifth column. People who were born and raised in this country are more English than the English people themselves, have now become this pariah community. So in the face and the light of all of that, in addition to being Guantanamo detainees who by definition and default are terrorism suspects, and then try to build a family life around that, with the children being attacked at school, sometimes being called names, sons of terrorists, children of terrorists. How does one pick up that? Who trains you for this? Who teaches you how to deal with this? Nobody. And the only thing that we had as former Guantanamo prisoners is our faith. That is what helped us in Guantanamo. That is what helped us through torture. It is what helped us in solitary confinement, and it is what helps us now. And in a world where Islam is seen as the most radicalizing factor, the key that sparks off all acts of terrorism, this is a time when our Islam is becoming stronger and stronger. So we reject this idea that Islam turns people towards terrorism, but at the same time, what's happening right now, we are being pushed into a situation where we find that that is our only refuge.
Perhaps we could go back a little bit, back into the early. In your book, you write quite a bit about your involvement with the Lynx gang in Birmingham. I wonder if if I could draw you to talk a little bit about what it was like to grow up in a multicultural setting, plagued by, at the same time, the politics of racism and far-right movements. And perhaps compare that moment to what you see now in the UK.
Interestingly, my father sent me to a Jewish school as a Muslim kid, so I was a minority in the school that I went to. I grew up learning Hebrew and reading from the Torah and celebrating Hanukkah, Pesach, and Purim, and so forth, and that was odd at the time. But it opened a door to me, which was one that helped me to recognize other communities, and it helped to recognize earlier on the concept of persecuted or criminalized communities. So I had friends who were not only Jewish, but also the neighborhood where we lived in initially, there were a lot of Irish people. And they, during the time when I was growing up, were the suspect criminalized terrorist community because of what was happening in the north of Ireland. But growing up in Britain during that time, when there was an influx of immigrants from the South Asian subcontinent, had its own difficulties, and we were regarded as, by many from the far right at the time, as people unwelcome. We were attacked in the streets, we were beaten, we were punched and kicked and abused, and we formed little groups to defend ourselves, and one of them was called the Lynx in Birmingham, and it was a multi-ethnic group which consisted of young black, Asian, Arab and Irish kids who simply wanted to be teenagers together, form themselves into a gang, and if do no good, but at least to defend themselves against racists. We did everything else than any other gang member, I suppose, does, which isn't something to be proud of. But I think the one aspect of pride that we did have, and still have to this day, is that we fought off the racists.
When you talk about Islamophobia today, and you talk about your experiences growing up as a Pakistani in England, what happens to young Pakistani kids today in England with that change of Islamophobia added to it?
So there are groups. There were groups during when I was growing up who were identified as different ethnic groups and different multi-ethnic groups, from the Afro-Caribbean, from the Irish, and from the Asian communities, who were foreign, and were the disdain against them was based upon the fact that they were the foreigners, and the xenophobia was palpable. What's different now today is that you've got organizations who, on the basis of nationalism, ultra-nationalism, will say that we accept these other groups of people as long as they are integrated and assimilated. But groups like the Muslims, and they've specified the Muslim community, cannot, by definition, assimilate, cannot become the same as us in a robotic fashion, and therefore they are seen as a threat. And if you add to this the mix of foreign policy, if you add it to it the mix of statements from the media and politicians in relation to whether it's the Muslim dress, the Muslim eating habits, Muslim prayer rituals, and so forth, then the atmosphere has been created where it's open season on all things Muslims. And so what we find now is that they will say things like, not all Muslims are terrorists, but every terrorist is a Muslim, which of course is a lie, and not factually true, but it feeds into the sort of anti-Islamic statements that are being made all around the world.
Ron asked you about how what it was like to come back, and you talked about the difficulty in repairing family relationships and your personal life when you come back. What pushed you into deciding to enter public life and to write the book?
And Guantanamo did. In essence, Guantanamo pushed me into wanting to talk about these issues. I realized from my discussions, or rather interrogations from the American interrogators, that with the greatest of respects, a lot of these people really didn't know what they were doing or what world they were dealing with. They had perhaps been involved in dealing with drug dealers in New York or anywhere else in the United States of America, but now they had come to countries whose names they couldn't pronounce and talk to people in languages they didn't know existed, and then suggest somehow that they understood the psyche and the mentality and the history and the heritage and the knowledge of these people, where you had the cradles of civilization. And it seemed bizarre to me that these people were now physically and attempting to psychologically dictate how the politics and the future of this region will ensue. And so I think that having seen what they felt they were doing in comparison to what they really were doing, it was important for me to start to talk about and try to explain things. So my process of trying to explain, my process of campaigning, as it were, began in Guantanamo. It began in solitary confinement. It began in Bagram with the interrogators, with the CIA and with the FBI and military intelligence. And also trying to advocate for the short periods of time that I was able to do so, when I was not in solitary confinement, the rights of other prisoners. The worst thing, I think, that a person has to endure, in addition to, or perhaps even more than, his own torture, is witnessing the abuse and torture of another person in front of you and then remaining silent or impotent to do anything about it. So that, I think, was for me the reason to campaign, and also accountability. We're living in a world where everybody wants to hold everybody else to account and say and point fingers. And we had plenty of fingers pointed at us as former prisoners. I was accused of hundreds of things, all sorts of statements, and because there was no access to any legal recourse, people could say whatever they wanted. And one's detention would be based upon what another person said, not on evidence. So people often say after my return, do you think that MI5 and the intelligence services are watching you? And I turn around and say, actually I don't care, because I'm watching them. And that's part of our job. Part of the job of cage prisoners is to record, is to document, and then present to the legal authorities, to the judicial authorities, and to the police, the actions of British intelligence in the torture and the complicity of torture of their own citizens.
What was the reception of the book?
I received a very good reception of the book, both nationally and internationally, from the quarters where I expected it to be. So, traditional left-wing, middle-of-the-road press reported well on it. The right-wing, the far-right reported on it in the way that I expected them to. Oh, he doesn't say anything about what the Americans say. This is completely contrary to the Americans' interrogators' version of events, and so forth. But I think that the people who have read my book, and it has been translated into several different languages, often feed back to me saying that, are you going to do another a sequel to it? And I say, well, that it all depends if I get taken back to Guantanamo again.
What was the reception in the Muslim community?
As I expected, the Muslim community has been extremely sympathetic. It's been widely and well received in the Muslim community. I received a couple of years ago something that was called the Muslim Writers Award for Best Published Author. That in a great scheme of things, it doesn't really matter to me about these things. But I think what I managed to do with it was I knew that what I had to tell was important, and I knew that lots of people would listen. And my book wasn't really geared to gain sympathy from the Muslim community. I knew the Muslim community would be sympathetic by default. It was geared to introduce a world that wasn't just about Guantanamo. It was all of the processes that led to me being taken to Guantanamo and then afterwards. Guantanamo was simply 3 years of my life, but I was 40 years old by the time I wrote the book. And all of these things, I felt it was important in my little way to tell the story of one person's experience.
And then after you wrote the book, could you talk a little bit about how you came to be involved with Cage Prisoners and your sort of early involvement with the organization, and then how you came to take this role that you're in now?
Yeah. One good thing that I hear about now is that the prisoners in Guantanamo, they know about Cage Prisoners. They'll often talk about and send messages through the lawyers and themselves direct to us about us. But when I was in Guantanamo, I didn't know about Cage Prisoners. At that time, Cage Prisoners was simply a website, and it was a portal, an information portal, exclusively documenting the cases of the Guantanamo prisoners. So when I returned from Guantanamo, I found myself looking at the site every day, which it was being updated in terms of its news and content, and wanting to find out about the latest information about the prisoners that I left behind. And there's a sense of guilt, of course, for anyone who's freed from a place like that, is that you're free, you go and meet children of prisoners who are still held there, and you can't tell them anything. You can't say, you can't explain why you're free and why their father isn't. So I felt a sense of guilt. I felt a sense of importance that it was an important task for me, because I could do it, because I know that I can speak and give the voice. Lots of people would like to get out, and I've been entrusted by a lot of the prisoners who tell me, and if I felt that I was doing something wrong, I think they would tell me. But I meet prisoners all around the world, former prisoners, who endorse what I do, and that gives me hope and support, and they are my advisory council. All these prisoners from around the world, they're my advisory council, and I seek their consultation in what I do. And what I do is to help this organization, Cage Prisoners, become well known, become an authority, become respected, and become a voice for those prisoners who have none.
And what, just logistically, what did Cage Prisoners look like from the inside when you joined?
Or did you join? What was the mechanism?
I was regularly being contacted by the organisation to speak at their events, to talk about some of the experiences that I'd seen and others, and to be in contact with them about other prisoners, about lawyers, and networking. I also built up a prisoner network of people who were not in Guantanamo, in Bagram and the secret detentions, and even here in the UK. So I had a lot of close contact with prisoners, for example, here in the UK, who were held either under control orders or under deportation orders, extradition orders, or were held, for example, without charge in UK prisons. And all those who were, I believe, unjustifiably convicted or given extraordinarily long sentences for crimes that were not crimes just a couple of years ago. So all of that was part of how I got involved in the organisation, talking about their cases, and then eventually, after being so involved in the mechanics of the organisation, I was asked to join it officially by its board members. The organisation was small when I joined it. It was, as I said, it was just a website, and every now and then they did a few protests, and they did some events and some meetings, and meetings used to take place in people's houses.
Who were the figures who were involved in it? As an American, I don't know much about it.
At the time, it was there were volunteers. There was one woman who was a central figure of it, who's no longer with the organisation, but she was a very central figure in terms of uploading the content, in terms of being like almost an oracle of information. There was Asim Qureshi, who was a junior researcher at the time. There was a couple of doctors and a couple of lawyers who had helped to set up the organisation. But after I joined, it really moved into the public arena, became more of a campaign organisation, and has moved along now to something that's closer to a think tank than just a campaign organisation. But it is both.
And what were some of the early projects that you were involved with once you kind of moved more centrally into the functioning of cage prisoners?
Well, there were investigations taking place into the disappeared. So one of the early reports I remember that Asim Qureshi, for example, had written was about the ghost prisoners, about people who were unfortunate enough or fortunate enough, depending how you look at it, not to be sent to Guantanamo, and were held in secret detention sites. So trying to locate them became, for me, or several of them, became a personal matter, because some of them I'd known or known of, and had met their families and have subsequently been in contact with them. And I'm still trying to, in some cases, locate these disappeared individuals, of whom it was widely reported that the Americans had captured, but now are disappeared into black holes, literally. So that was an important issue. Also, there was the issues regarding the United Kingdom. People soon approached me and said, "We know you're talking about Guantanamo, and we realize how difficult that issue is, but please also remember us here in the UK, because there are very close similarities." And also one thing that was very important is that a lot of my work took me to Northern Ireland to meet with former prisoners there, with primarily Republican prisoners, but also some loyalists, and then to talk to them about internment and get feedback and information, be involved in seminars which made comparisons between the experience of the Irish and the Muslim community. And since that time until now, I have some very close Irish Republican friends.
Do you remember a conversation in particular with any of these
Yes, I
either
mean,
Republicans or loyalists that you talked to?
There's one I know that is often said by a lot of the Republican prisoners, and they say, Moazzam, at least they'd wait until we speak and they could hear our accents. But with you guys, they see you coming off, a mile away. And I said, of course, that's true, unless you happen to be an indigenous Irish Muslim, then you're really screwed.
As criminalized communities, what difference do you see between the experience of the Irish and the experience of Muslims in Britain now, or equally what continuities?
It's funny you say that, because there's a group called the Continuity IRA, but that's a different matter. The reality of the two experiences was put to me quite succinctly by my lawyer, Gareth Pearce, in 1998, when she said to me, "Moazzam, it was the turn of the Irish for a period, but you're next," meaning the Muslim community. And she was right. She had predicted something. 1998 was the year of the Omar bombing, which was carried out, I believe, by the real or the Continuity IRA in 98, but also it was the year of the Tanzania and Kenya bombings by Al-Qaeda. So she was looking at these experiences and seeing the the debris from this and where that was spreading to. But she foresaw that it was coming for the Muslims, and she was right. The parallels are clear in terms of the word terrorist at that time, I remember, became synonymous with Irish Republicans, even though loyalists were carrying it out too. The word terrorist today is synonymous with Muslims and jihad, in particular, this concept. So we are told that we are, because of these concepts in our faith, we are a terrorist community, or we are one that sympathizes with terrorism, or we are a conveyor belt of terrorism, or we are Trojan horses of terrorism. All these sorts of statements are being put to us. And what we hear from a lot of the Irish Republican prisoners now who are part of the peace process is they hate the word terrorism. They don't use it in their discussions. They don't even call the loyalists terrorists. They have all sorts of other names for them, but because this word terrorist really and truly, the most famous man on the planet, Nelson Mandela, is a convicted terrorist. So what does that do in terms of the uses of language? The Mujahideen in Afghanistan, when they were fighting against the Soviet Union called them terrorists. But the West and America in particular, after making films like Rambo 3 about them, lionized them and called them freedom fighters. So these terminologies are not lightly used in communities like the Irish community. And they will talk about legitimate struggle, they will talk about armed struggle, and they will talk about illegitimate struggle. They will talk about occupation forces and so forth. And their language will be entirely different. And then they will talk about, if you want to get to the end of this problem, they will talk about an all-inclusive dialogue, which includes talking to the most unpalatable sections of the conflict. And that is the lesson of Northern Ireland. And it's the proof of that is that you have Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, the First Minister, well, the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, who was an IRA leader. So it would be futile to use these types of terms like terrorist when you're talking about a peace process.
You talked about when you first caged prisoners, building networks. Now, one of those networks was a network of lawyers. How did you go about building them? Were those contacts you had, or were they? How did you find them?
The network of lawyers is really important, I think. The lawyers, they're the lifeline between the Guantanamo prisoners and the free world. The lawyers, despite the ridiculous restrictions placed upon them in terms of client-attorney privilege, that would not apply anywhere else on earth, they've managed to do quite an amazing job in terms of getting the cases of the prisoners out there. And so sometimes this is through personal contact. Many of them, even now, will personally contact me or other prisoners and ask in relation to their clients and what information we can give them, or they'll ask if we know anybody else who could help them in relation to their clients' cases. And of course, several people like Clive Stafford Smith are themselves almost a magnet of lawyers and activism in relation to the Guantanamo case, but also the Center for Constitutional Rights, who first represented me when I was in Guantanamo, and the American Civil Liberties Union, who are still fighting on the cases with us. So with all of these, and the independent lawyers, the unsung heroes often, they do quite amazing jobs in terms of trying to get the stories of the prisoners out. Some do it through the legal process, others do it through the campaigning and political process. All of them, I believe, have been instrumental in bringing the case of the Guantanamo prisoners to the public fore.
Are you still in contact with lawyers for cases down in Guantanamo?
I'm constantly in contact with lawyers, both civilian lawyers, military commissions lawyers, right across the board. People who don't agree with or believe in the system, but who are part of it and have been dealt the cards that they have, often contact me and other prisoners to find a way, any way, out for their clients. And by no means do they rely solely or even partially on the legal process, because they know that doesn't work.
Was there ever any internal debate within Caged Prisoners about the direction of the organisation in terms of it's going towards more, as you said, during your involvement, a more campaigning direction, or or on the other hand, taking a more legalistic approach. Was that a big subject of discussion, or was it?
We've had many discussions in terms of strategy and in terms of remit also. We have tended, even though there are 3 lawyers in Cage Prisoners, Cage Prisoners hasn't taken as itself, as an organization, legal actions. I think there are plenty and enough organizations doing that, and what we do is support them in that. So the closest working relationships we have are with, for example, Reprieve and the Centre for Constitutional Rights, with Gareth Pearce, and with other lawyers here in the UK and outside in the United States of America. We feel comfortable in doing that. We feel comfortable in being an information portal and conduit. We have the sources on the grounds like nobody else does. We know the prisoners, we know their families. We are the prisoners, in fact. Several of the prisoners are either working for Cage Prisoners or are part of the advisory board, official advisory board. So what we bring to the table is the people themselves.
You mentioned working with the families. What are some of the problems you face with the families, and what kinds of resources do you bring to help the families?
There are some of the most acute cases in terms of, for example, there's one family whose husband, father, has been disappeared in a US, well, we believe it was a US prison, and then it's now a Syrian prison that he was handed over by the US to the Syrians, to a secret prison, and that family has had no communication at all whatsoever with their loved one. That is probably the most extreme case that we have, and what we try to do for them is arrange or to get financial support, get contacts with members of the Syrian human rights community, with other human rights organizations, with embassies of different countries, and to help to find and investigate. In fact, we've been involved in and have actually located this woman's loved one in a Syrian prison and found exactly where he is. And sometimes that's done with great risk to some of our workers and some of our people. But we do it because we have a duty to do it, and also we have the ability to do it. In other cases, there are families, for example, whose loved ones are still in Guantanamo, in which we're trying to either seek through the resettlement process, with the help of other organizations like Amnesty and Reprieve and the Centre for Constitutional Rights, resettlement for these people, countries where they can go back to or go to because of fear of being tortured in their own countries. The great thing that's happened now, that I'm happy to have had some part in it, is helping to be involved in discussions for resettlement of people who want to go back to countries like Tunisia and Egypt after the revolutions that have happened there. So some momentous things are taking place, and it's of great joy for people who, for example, sentenced in absentia or feared torture for returning to these countries, now will be welcomed back as heroes, in a sense. Closer to home, there is an organization, our sister organization called HUGS, which is helping households under great stress, and that is set up mostly by women and some young men to arrange, whether it's simple things like activity days for children of parents who've been held under anti-terror legislation, or whether it's taking people to go and visit their family members, or taking food to people who are unable to cook for themselves and are suffering very physical, very practical issues. But for us as a campaign organization, we try to bring some hope through the experiences of the individuals in Cage Prisoners itself, or that we're connected to, because that is the one thing that we know from our experience, is that once that's gone, there's little left.
Do you have family therapy? Any kind of therapeutic outreach at all?
As Cage Prisoners, we don't have any therapy done ourselves, but we have close involvement with the Helen Bamber Foundation, for example, who have worked closely with the Guantanamo prisoners and others, and the Medical Foundation for the Victims of Torture. We work closely with both organizations.
I asked because in your book you said that you reached out to a therapist.
Uh, well, yes, it's true. I've reached out to several therapists and have been asked by them to come and speak to them. So it's not that they're seeking therapy from me, but I think that they are they're certainly trying to learn and help. I think in the way that they can. There was one particular incident, two incidents in Guantanamo I remember, where a psychiatrist was brought to me after I had an anxiety attack, and I remember one of the cases, this psychiatrist actually suggested a method of suicide to me and asked me had I ever thought about taking off my trousers, threading them with my sheet, tying the trouser part as a noose that would fit around my neck, tying it to the corner of the cell and jumping off. And I said, no, it never crossed my mind until she put the thought into my head. So there were all sorts of games being played in Guantanamo by psychotherapists.
To return to Cage Prisoners, one of the many striking things about the organization is the great geographic scope of some of the cases you're involved with. How do you manage that scope, given that Cage Prisoners is still a fairly small organization?
It's difficult. The answer, how do we manage all this? The reality is that we don't manage it. It manages itself. The people that are involved on the ground manage themselves, and they seek assistance from us, and we give them that assistance. So, for example, we have people we work with closely in Pakistan and in Kenya and in other places, where they take from our experience, we take from theirs. It's a symbiotic relationship. We provide people who have gone through the experiences of the prisoners, people who can give some tangible links as to where they could go next. But in all essence, the reality of the prisoner's situation is that it keeps building. It doesn't get smaller. I'd thought always that, well, once this is over, I'm going to go into something completely different. But it doesn't seem like there's an end. There is this war on terror, and its peripheries keep continuing. They keep opening up new doors. The detentions process, for example, when I was in Kenya just a few months ago, under what they call the new section of the war on terror, where it's linked with Somalia and so forth, was happening almost on a weekly basis. People were being detained and rendered. Rendition is still taking place, and British intelligence and American intelligence are still involved on the ground. And the same is true in Pakistan, of course. So it doesn't seem to me that this is going to end anytime shortly.
It's a little off my schedule, but Liz and I attended a seminar at CCR last Tuesday where Geeta talked, and she raised exactly the issue you raised about once this is over. And her argument is that we have to recognize that this is a permanent state, that it is not a temporary state, that we have moved to some kind of a state of permanency with the war on terror. Is that too bleak a picture, or do you see it somewhat differently?
I think the reality is that President Obama was in that position to let us know exactly what's going to happen next, and he's shown very, very clearly, I mean, unequivocally, that the state of the war on terror, even though the term itself is defunct, de facto it's going on, and it will continue, and it will expand, and it has expanded. And I think even in relation to the Arab Spring, we will see the war on terror extend there once it settles down. One thing I realize, although Gaddafi and the Syrian regime also both have used the Al-Qaeda spectre in an effort to try to delegitimize these revolutions, once I believe both these countries, in particular, the revolutions are successful, we will see the rise of Islamic parties, as we have seen in Tunisia, as we have seen in Egypt. And the West's reluctance to engage with or to recognize either of those groups of people. Again, if they don't do this, they will begin a new war on terror. And so I think this permanent state of hostility, is going to remain as long as the attitudes that allow them to persist remain.
Why do you think that the United States, the UK, EU, why do you think they're unable to make that opening?
They're unable to make that opening because I think they know very, very well that the psychology of the Arab and Muslim person isn't as amnesiac as they would like it to be. So they know that, for example, when the Iranian Revolution took place, even though it was a Shiite one, Saddam Hussein was backed and supported to invade Iran and to kill millions of Iranians as a result of their policy. So we know through history that whatever it is that has the veneer of Islam on it will be regarded as suspect. And you can see, for example, the refusal to engage with the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they were the most legitimate opposition group during Hosni Mubarak's time, has only festered a dislike for the United States. You can ask anybody in Egypt from the Brotherhood. They do not like the United States. It doesn't mean they want to be at a state of war with them, but they have a memory. They remember what happened. They remember that Mubarak was supported by the Americans and the West at a time when their members were thrown into prison and tortured and beaten to death in some cases. Even though the Brotherhood didn't take up the violent methodology of the other Islamic groups, they still will remember that they were left and these regimes were backed by the West. So Tony Blair and the West in general had made their peace with Gaddafi after he had said that he will no longer be part of the nuclear arms race. He was the new boy on the block again. He was being greeted by the West, and you can see that the cannon fodder in all of this were these Libyan dissidents, people who had opposed him. They were from the Islamic movements, but they were solely involved in opposing Gaddafi and removing him. So these people became the pawns in this game and were put on control orders, financial sanctions, and detained without charge in some cases. And now, those same people, I have met them in Libya. These same people who were detained in the UK are now in Libya, supported by British forces, supported by British aircraft, fighting against the Gaddafi regime. So these people, they won't forget. They know that there are interests, that it's in their interests to be protected by American and British bombs, and they welcome that. But they are no friends of the West. And one thing also is known in Libya is that parts of the East produced some of the people who went to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, and all of this is in the psyche of the people. That's why you can see on the streets of Libya, in Benghazi, it says, in Arabic you'll see it, and in English, it says no to Al-Qaeda, and it says no to foreign troops. We don't want either.
I believe you were recently in Benghazi. Could you talk a little bit about the experience of that trip and being there in this time of great, turmoil and change?
I went to Egypt recently with a view to visit Libya. On my way, I met with several former Guantanamo, or a few former Guantanamo prisoners, a few former Brotherhood prisoners, and really the purpose of it was primarily the case of Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. And he was a Libyan man who I'd been held with around the same time, who was at the time in 2001 in Bagram. It was said that he was the most senior Al-Qaeda captive to date. When the CIA interrogated me and threatened to send me to Egypt in Bagram, they said that if you don't cooperate with us, we'll do to you what we did to Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. And what they told me they did to him was that they sent him to Egypt. And I thought they were bluffing at the time, and later when I was released, I realized the case of Ibn al-Sheikh was huge, that he'd been sent to Egypt, that he was tortured under the auspices of Omar Suleiman, who is now under house arrest. But during that torture, he confessed to working with Saddam Hussein on obtaining weapons of mass destruction to kill Americans. And that statement was used by Colin Powell in 2003 to try to justify a case of war in Iraq. Ibn al-Sheikh's statement was accepted a year later as a fabrication. He was then, after being sent to do a series of Eastern European prisons and elsewhere, sent to the one place where he feared the most, Libya, because he was a Libyan. And there he remained until 2008 in May, when he allegedly turned up in his prison cell dead because of hanging himself. I met with 2 prisoners in Benghazi who'd spent the last years of their life with him, the last days of their life, of his life with him. And they both told me quite categorically, one of them is a former Guantanamo prisoner, the other had been held in Gaddafi's prisons for 22 years. And both told me that it was not a suicide, that he had been either killed directly or as a result of neglect that was something he suffered after having razor blades slashed across his chest and his body and being left to bleed for ages and apparently contracting some blood diseases and becoming weak and dying in a state. What was interesting, they told me that he was being interrogated in Libyan custody by US intelligence until the last days of his death. And so this, and recognizing how bizarre history and these events are, that this man who'd served in prison for 22 years for being an opponent of Gaddafi was now seen to be one of the spiritual heads of the movement supported by America.
We turn from back to cage prisoners. How large is the organization? How many people work here? How is it structured?
Cage Prison is a relatively small organization. This is our first major office that we have here in London. We have, I think now we've just taken on one person, 4 full-time workers, 4.5 full-time workers, one person who part-time works on the Arabic section, and we have myself as a director, Asim Qureshi as an executive director. We have the Guantanamo expert, Andy Worthington, who's just left the organization now. And we have another former Guantanamo prisoner and a former control order detainee, as well as other interns who have their specialist fields working in our organization. What's really amazing about it is that we attract a lot of people from the human rights community who want to be involved, who want to do internships in our organization. We've had several Americans, non-Muslims, who've produced some quite amazing work for us. And so the organization, in that sense, I think it punches above its weight category. And in terms of the structure, we have a board, we have our patrons, and they include Victoria Britton and Yvonne Ridley and Lauren Booth, who was Tony Blair's sister-in-law, which I think is so funny. And Samuel Hadj, also the former Guantanamo prisoner and Al Jazeera cameraman. And we are constantly receiving support from all walks of life. We are constantly being attacked, it must be said, in the media and in the right-wing press in particular, for our associations or our links with people who are regarded as terrorism suspects, and for our defending their rights and fighting for them and advocating for them. And it's true, we tread on eggshells. Sometimes we produce work that people don't like to see or don't like to hear, but that's, I think, where we gain a great deal of our legitimacy in terms of the people we represent.
Could you talk a little bit about, obviously one of the major cases that's been brought up in the right-wing press not too long ago was your supposed association with al-Awlaki. Could you talk about what was said of you and how you responded to that?
My first encounter with al-Awlaki was an interview I did with him over the telephone shortly after his release from a prison cell in Yemen. He made it clear that there were things that he didn't want to talk about when I asked him about his treatment and what had actually happened to him in terms of any abuses. It is my personal belief, after having read and heard from people what they said of him, and that he was hugely popular in the English-speaking world. And it's really important just to get this point clarified, because Awlaki isn't hugely popular in the Arabic-speaking world because he's relatively young, and in the Arabic-speaking world, there are scholars of much higher standing than Awlaki. And so this is again something we do in the West. If he speaks English, he's got to be big. The reality, he isn't in the Arab world. There are much bigger people than him. The suggestion, for example, that he will now take Al-Qaeda's leadership has only been happening in the English-speaking world. It has not been happening in the Arabic-speaking world. And so, yes, we have this American dual citizen who's a Yemeni, who at one point condemned openly the Twin Towers attack, who was cleared by security in the United States to visit the Pentagon, and all of these things, has now all of a sudden done a U-turn. When does he do it? He does it straight after his interrogation, in which he says that American intelligence were present. What happened there, what transpired, what is it that made him say those things, I don't know, because when I interviewed him, he hadn't really taken a really radical position. Omar Abdul Muttalib and all those people, Nida al-Hassan, had not, those cases had not come to the fore at the time. Our campaigning for him, therefore, was as somebody who'd been detained, somebody who'd been a prominent figure, and somebody who'd had the US war on terror mechanism affect him. We campaign for him even more now so in the sense that he is somebody who's been targeted for assassination by the US president, and we see that as something extrajudicial. We would have campaigned for Osama bin Laden had he been detained, and we would have fought for his rights too, just as we have fought for the rights of Abu Qatada or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and we make no apologies about that. And that is because we believe, and I believe, that anybody who stands accused of crimes has to have his day in court, and I don't think that's too much to ask for anybody, considering that we are nations of people who gave those rights to people who committed much greater atrocities at the end of the Second World War, and we're even attempting now to give them to Ratko Mladic, Slobodan Milosevic in the past, and others. And I was in Bosnia when these things happened, and I know that these massacres were on a massive scale in comparison to what these people stand accused of.
I was going to ask you about what your reaction would have been to Mladic's arrest, so I'm glad you touched on it. Because, as you say, it does beg the comparison with this other aspect of your work, which is on extrajudicial killings. But if I may tilt back to what Cage Prisoners is doing in Pakistan, could you talk a little bit more about the Pakistan project?
Yes.
And the question of the disappearances versus dealing with detentions. Just when you're working on these, on the grain of these different cases, what are the differences?
Clearly, what you can see is that Pakistan was never a country that was known for its human rights or its great development or anything. But something that wasn't known in Pakistan was disappearance. People didn't disappear in Pakistan. They would perhaps be kidnapped for ransom by some northern tribesmen and returned. But there was nothing in terms of state-sponsored disappearances. It didn't happen until the war on terror began, until the United States gave the green light to Musharraf and others to begin this policy. So what we've had in essence, and I know because I was disappeared during that time. For a period I was actually disappeared. Nobody knew where I was, other than the people who'd taken me. The fact that a state did it doesn't mean it's any less reprehensible. In fact, it's worse. We work closely with the Defense for Human Rights and Amina Masood Janjua, who herself is suffering the great trauma of having her own husband disappeared. And she has lodged numerous cases in the Pakistan courts and fought and campaigned and single-handedly tried to bring all of these cases in together, whether it's the Pakistanis held in Bagram, whether it's the Pakistanis held in Guantanamo, or whether it's the ones that have been disappeared. War on terror or Baluchi nationalists, doesn't really matter for her. So we have a joint working relationship with the Defense for Human Rights group, and are regularly updated by them and regularly try to place pressure on the US, on the Pakistani government through the testimony of individuals that we have, in order that we can have at least these people recognized, at least they can be in communication with their families. The fact that this has happened in Pakistan, because there are so many other traumas taking place, subsequently in Pakistan. It often seems like Amina Masood and the little help that we give her is fighting an uphill battle all on her own. But the one amazing thing is that everybody in Pakistan knows her. She is a name that if you mention her to any Pakistani, they know the name. And in that sense, she has done an amazing job as a woman who's suffering through this trauma, not just to be considered by the disappearance of her own husband, but to be considered by the disappearances of other people, and that takes great strength.
Do you think this model of involvement with an organization like hers in Pakistan could be replicable to other countries in other parts of the world, say in East Africa or elsewhere?
Yes, I think so. I think it's possible. I think the dynamics are slightly different in different places, but we've attempted to do something similar in Kenya, but Kenya has proved to be a little more difficult in that even the human rights workers who are not even Muslims that have worked there on these cases have sometimes been deported either from Uganda or deported from Kenya, have been interrogated and frightened by intelligence officers operating there. I spoke in the largest mosque in East Africa to a congregation of 12,000 people about standing up as a community, about fighting for the rights of their own citizens, about the ideas of citizens of their country who have been rendered and handed over to another country to be interrogated by British and American intelligence officers, and to tell them that if they don't do this, then they could very easily be next. And that has been our experience here in the UK, where initially we found a great deal of apathy and fear, and now cage prisoners everybody knows cage prisoners in the Muslim community. And they know it because what we said transpired, is that if you don't take the bull by the horns now, when they come for you in whatever way they do, whether it's Schedule 7 airport stops, or whether it's stop and search, or whether it's detention without trial, or whether it's anti-terror legislation, you'll have nobody to blame but yourself if you don't take a position now.
Recognizing the variety of the Muslim community in Britain, what are your relationships in the community? You mentioned everyone recognizes. That means that somehow you have a pulse, or you have some kind of feeling for the community.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say, first of all, that the Muslim community is not homogeneous. It's not one single monolithic community. But generally we can say that, and it's a very general term, broadly said, that the Muslim community, through various organizations that seem to be in the public for, speak with us, we talk together often, we are present at their invitations, we are recognized by them for the work we do. And so even though before in the past there was a great deal of fear, cage prisoners need to stay away from these guys because they're terrorism related stuff and we don't want to see our funding cut by our association, all that sort of stuff does happen. But there's no escaping the message. There's no escaping what we're talking about. There's no escaping the experiences of the Guantanamo prisoners or the UK prisoners or detention without trial or control orders. There's no escaping any of this. It's a reality. And in the end, you'll have to somehow come and communicate with the people who know about it like no one else does.
I've worked with a number of groups where that kind of existential situation does not happen, in which the debate within the group is always over the line. But it kind of strikes me that the situation on the ground is so radical itself that a debate over the line is superfluous.
It is.
Is that fair, or is that?
You're right. It is the debate over the line, whatever it is. It's well beyond that. And as far as cage prison is concerned, I think some people would see us that our discussions are beyond the line. And we will talk about things that other NGOs won't talk about. But we feel that we're in a position to talk about these things, even if it's at the cost sometimes of other organizations saying, well, we don't really want to be associated with you in this regard. They're not feeling it. With the greatest of respect to all other organizations, and without wanting to seem to be playing the victim card. They're not feeling it on a day-to-day basis. They go home and they sleep it off, and it doesn't mean anything. We go home and it's in our face. We go home, we expect a knock on the door. All of us do. Doesn't matter who we are. We see a police car behind us, we think it's coming for us. We're at the airports, we get stopped, we get interrogated, we get questioned. And so we do the work. The people who are affected by this attitude and legislation here in Cage Prisoners do the work. In the other organizations, they don't. And that's not their fault. Nobody's blaming them for it. But there's a difference between something that affects you directly, personally, and that's something that is your job, in essence.
In the current political and discursive climate in the UK, have you sought any political allies, or do you find that in the ambitions of the campaigning of Cage Prisoners, what kind of mark can you make on the political playing field?
Yes, we do. We constantly seek dialogue and discussion with people in power, and have been in discussions with ministers of this government. The last government wasn't so easy, but this government, yes. We've been involved in, at least as individuals, discussions with ministers, senior ministers, about different issues. We've been involved with people who are reviewers of terrorism as appointed by the government. We have put forward our grievances and our recognition of the situation and our analysis of the situation. We have engaged with politicians who will engage with us. We have sought alliance with groups who would seek alliance with us. But we haven't sort of done the bend over backwards, trying our best to accommodate everybody simply to get into their good books, because we've seen so much of that. And in the end, we feel that type of behavior simply undermines your own credibility. So we try to remain true to our goals and principles. We are not sectarian. We are not primarily a religious organization. We have religious ethos in terms of being Muslims, but we're not a religious proselytizing organization. We believe in the rule of law, and we advocate for that, for all communities and for everyone. And if that is something that, in terms of how we do our job, is not what everybody wants to be involved with, we don't impose ourselves on anyone.
I'm intrigued that it's easier to work with this government than the previous governments. Yeah. My old lefty background says why?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the politics, then we would have said, of course, that the more left-wing government would be easier to work with. But of course, the politics of New Labour and the new government have changed so much, so it's almost unrecognisable. The politics of Tony Blair were more right-wing than the right-wing of today. And it's blurred. It's very, very blurred. The new government, the discussions we've had with the new government, suggest, at least in word if not in deed, that they want to show themselves to be part of the process that helps to rectify the most unpopular war that's been around in the history of Britain, which showed that British people marched over 2 million. I mean, British people don't march in great numbers for anything. So the fact that they did this shows it wasn't just the Muslims getting radicalized, it was the entire nation. But in addition to this, also, they have attempted to engage with some of us in terms of what's happened to the abuses of the Guantánamo prisoners, the allegations of British intelligence involved in the torture of British citizens has been extremely sensitive. It has shaken the government, I believe. And our engagement has been through the civil legal process, but also through the criminal process. We're talking to the police about actions of the British intelligence. So we are talking across the board to a whole lot of people who probably we wouldn't have before in the past.
But your political activities would be limited by your charter. There are certain things politically that you cannot do as
That's
an
right. That's right.
organization.
We're not involved in any campaigning for any organisation or any political party. We're not affiliated to any political party. Neither do we take any position on any groups that are campaigning. Our simple work is our remit, which is to campaign and fight for the rights of the people who have been detained without charge or trial, or people who have been, we believe, subjected to anti-terror legislation that is not fitting for the crime that they're accused of.
Could you, we've skirted around the edges of this issue, but could you talk a little bit, maybe in detail, about your reaction to the news of Osama bin Laden's death?
Well, to be honest with you, when I hear about the death of any Muslim, my personal reaction is to say, from Allah we came and unto Allah we return, and Allah will deal with whoever He wishes, however He wishes. Of course, Osama bin Laden was dealt with in this world, and in this world, I believe there are rules and regulations that are supposed to be followed. I cannot support what the Americans have done, because the Americans took me in Islamabad with a gun to my head in the middle of the night in front of my family. It was just that movement between me and death. So how could I support this? How could I say that it was okay for him to do this, okay for them to do this? If they believe he's responsible for a crime, then why didn't they capture him and take him? And then the stories put out make it even worse in terms of how I perceive this. They said that his wife was placed in front of him as a shield, which turned out to be a lie. Said that he was armed. That turned out to be a lie. So all of the lies that have been put forward, contrasted to the jubilation clearly that is available in America in terms of the death of Osama bin Laden, I don't believe justice has been done in any way, shape or form with his assassination. And the only way to describe it is the assassination of Osama bin Laden. Along with, of course, the other people who were killed. It's as if they don't count. These other people are simply peripheral. To shoot a person in front of his child. I was taken at gunpoint in front of my children. How could I accept this for anybody else? So my reaction is that Osama bin Laden, in the great scheme of things, other than a symbol, won't make a great deal of difference. The war on terror will continue, and the responses, as we've seen in Pakistan and Afghanistan over the past week or two, is that scores of people have been killed. Is it worth it? Is this the direction which we want to go in? If they captured bin Laden and prosecuted him and showed that yes, he really did commit these crimes somehow, or was there something else hidden? Were there things that they didn't want to be materialized? Were there things like with Saddam Hussein's case, I believe that would have come to the fore, that at some point somebody would have had to say who supported him when he gassed the Iranians? Is there that sort of information that people don't want coming out? Otherwise, why would you allow these sorts of things to take place? So I remain exceedingly skeptical.
It's quite different from the Nuremberg example of an international tribunal.
There's no comparison at all. I mean, this is an extrajudicial killing. This is Obama. Obama is the president of extrajudicial killing, as Bush was the president of extrajudicial detention.
When you look back on caged prisoners, what do you think your greatest achievement has been so far?
Our greatest achievement thus far?
Staying alive, probably.
I think our greatest achievement thus far has been moving from an organization that was obscure and nobody knew to a point that it is now being mentioned by people in power in the world, who know it, who have seen its work, and who I have presented directly to some of the leaders of the world and told that this organization campaigns for people who are in the world's most notorious prison. And in terms of achievement, I think we can see it in the real tangible achievement. The responses we get from family members, from children, from wives and people like that who say that we are so pleased that Cageprisoners is fighting our cause and our case because nobody else is. So that to me is an achievement in that it's helped to empower a community that has become very frightened and very apprehensive. And that is one of our aims and objectives.
Conversely, what would you feel is your greatest failure?
Greatest failure? We still have 4 people working with the organisation. We should have been much bigger by now. I think our greatest failure really probably has been in being able to take on the cases, all the cases that we should, and to campaign adequately for all the cases that deserve our attention, and not being able to do so because of lack of resource.
We were talking a few months ago, informally, about your international travels. I wonder if you can talk a few more minutes about that. Libya, Iran.
One of the recent visits I had in Libya had me and a group of people go and meet with some former prisoners in a prison in Benghazi. And they toured us around this prison that had been captured now by the rebels and had been burnt out and destroyed. And they took us into the interrogation cells. And one place they took me to was a place where they told me that a woman who now lives in the UK, a Libyan woman, had been abused and tortured. And they showed me this cell. It was to walk into it seemed very bizarre. It seemed like an ordinary place. It seemed like a house that had been burnt down. It just seemed very ordinary. But then they took me into these holding cells and showed me these rows of cells. And ultimately, the block, it reminded me of Guantanamo. But the difference was that these were concrete structures, and they were tiny. It was impossible for somebody as short as me to actually physically lie down in this cell. I don't know how people could have slept there except to curl up in a fetal position and lie down in this horrific cell. And what was also amazing is that people had, there were still drawings in there that had been made by pencil, Quranic verses that talk about patience at the time of adversity, verses that spoke about the story of the prophet Joseph or Yusuf, who was thrown into prison according to the Bible and the Quran for a crime that he didn't commit. There were also drawings of freedom, of trees, of the sea, of children, of cars, that were still very visible. And all of the thoughts of your own incarceration, of course, come rushing back to your head. But the people who were telling me about this had themselves spent a great deal of time in this prison and also in the prison that is still, as we speak, run by Gaddafi in Tripoli, the prison where Ibn Sheikh al-Libi died, Abu Salim prison.
What about Iran?
Iran, I went for a conference recently, which was one to discuss terrorism and the concept of terrorism. And during this conference, amongst other people, we met the president, and I delivered a speech in front of the president in which I talked about the concept of terrorism and how this term, as had been explained by one of my Irish friends who was also present at the conference, is one that people shouldn't necessarily use simply because it's being used in the West. And people need to come up with terms, not only just to accuse others of being this, but to try to deconstruct it and to see a way forward. Because what we've seen through the experience of quote-unquote terrorism is that once you've labeled somebody a terrorist, it's very hard then to start to get into an engagement with them, to talk to them, to legitimize them. And this is the problem that I know that the United States is facing in Afghanistan, for example, with talking to the Taliban. Well, how can you talk to an organization that is all but human? It is subhuman. When then you try to humanize people, and I think one of the people who did this, even though he's the head of the anti-Bin Laden unit at the time, was Michael Schur, who spoke about, in his book on Osama bin Laden, he says, that the mistakes that the West has made is in the failure to recognize, for example, Osama's piety, his integrity, his personal bravery, his egalitarianism, and things like this. So if you do that to your enemy, even though you want to capture and kill him, and Shur says that we wanted to capture and kill him, then at least you've humanized them. Then at least you're not talking about an animal or a monster. And that's what's happened in the dehumanization processes on both sides. When we were dehumanized, it was done because of the differences that people were told that we had, and therefore it was easy to torture us. But when you humanize somebody, it becomes much harder then to do all the things that you do to them. And then it's easier, if you humanize them, to also bring them into an engagement process so that you can bring an end to the conflict somehow.
You were suggesting earlier essentially a conceptual failure, a failure in language. How does one go about changing that language, or incrementally even? And does Cage Prisoners have a role to play in that task?
We often talk about language. We often talk about the use, the misuse, and the manipulation of language for all sorts of purposes. And one of the things we'll say, for example, the word terrorism, how did it ever enter the English language? And it came into the use of the English language from Le Grand Terror, which is French for the Great Terror, and that was the revolution. So as far as the elite of Europe were concerned, the introduction of democracy in the UK, in Europe, was terrorism. It was the beheading of the aristocrats and the Revolution. So, and if you look at the New American Heritage Dictionary, you'll see that the word terrorism is used to describe individuals and organizations, but doesn't mention states. Whereas previous ones mention states are involved in terrorism or can be involved in terrorism. So we think that the redefining of language or by interested sources is something we need to challenge. And the greatest example for us as Muslims is the word jihad. And you can see now, you can go to the average American and he'll say jihad is terrorism. Anybody who believes in jihad is a terrorist. And we won't say that we'll have this argument to say, well, jihad only means the internal spiritual struggle. And it doesn't mean that. It means so many things. But the greatest evidence of the hypocrisy and the manipulation of language is in itself as to how the West, in particular the United States, has dealt with this issue. So you can see Mujahideen during the 80s was a word that was synonymous with the people who fought against the Soviet Union. And they were glorified. They were given Stinger anti-aircraft weapons, and presidents would descend into Pakistan and try to meet with the tribesmen there. And yet today the word jihad does not, it's as if that whole period didn't exist. So it's very difficult for us as a community to try to take this on when we think there's a concept of self-defense that is ennobled within the Muslim faith, has now become demonized because of the use and the manipulation of language. Somebody can say that person is a jihadist. That's an Arabic word that has an English suffix. Doesn't make any sense.
Beyond language, I know that you've written poetry as well, and I think on the Cage Prisoners website, one of amongst the many things that people can do, there's the suggestion that writing poetry and writing and creating art is an avenue. And I believe you recently were judging a writing award. Could you talk a little bit about poetry, what it did for you? And,
just a word also to be said on art is that Cage Prisoners did in 2008 an art exhibition called it was called Interned, the Art of the Imprisoned, and this was something that was primarily done by prisoners here in the UK, prisoners held on extradition, deportation, and control orders, and it was amazing artwork that they'd produced. They'd made mosques and ships and boxes and jewelry boxes out of little matchsticks in prison. And it also, this sort of reminded me of some of the things that I'd seen in the Northern Ireland prison museums. people who wanted to preserve some of the heritage of their story of prison. There was pottery, beautiful pots, plant pots and urns made by the prisoners. And it showed a side of these people that, of course, that the authorities don't want you to see, that they can create, that they can think, that they have families behind them, that they have made these things for their loved ones. They haven't made it for the exhibition. They made it for their loved ones. And they have a heart, and that heart is broken because of the situation that they're put in, and their children's hearts are broken, and their letters and their poems have all been displayed in this exhibition. And so some of my own poetry and other people's poetry was also displayed. And for me, poetry was something that helped to not just give my voice to the people I wanted to hear it, but to myself also. I'm talking to myself. I'm having a conversation with myself, as crazy as that may sound, but I understand me. And also, I wanted my captors to see it. I knew that when I'd send these poems, it would have to go through censorship. And in the small chance that the person who's censoring these poems might even understand a little bit of it, it was worth the effort.
Actually, I think that's a nice place to stop. On the small chance that someone in the future will see this as part of the conversation. Thank you very much.